When comedian Bill Burr appears on The Tonight Show, he expects the usual late-night banter. Instead, he's ambushed by Jimmy Fallon, who launches a shocking attack on his character. What follows is an explosive showdown no one saw coming. The night started like any other on the glitzy set of The Tonight Show. Lights dimmed, the crowd roared, and Jimmy Fallon slid onto the stage with his usual manic energy. But something was off. Even through his smile, there was a sharpness in his eyes. Bill Burr, the evening's guest, strolled out to thunderous applause, cracking a self-deprecating joke as he took his seat. The audience laughed. Jimmy didn't. At first it seemed like Fallon was just trying to push boundaries. He teased Bill about his past controversial takes. Nothing new there. Bill responded with his trademark shrug and wry grin. But then Jimmy's tone shifted. His jokes weren't jokes anymore. They were jabs. Without warning, Fallon leaned forward, eyes glinting with performative outrage, and began tearing into Burr's stand-up career. He called Bill's comedy dangerous, toxic, and coated with racism. The crowd fell into a stunned silence, unsure if this was a bit or something real unraveling. Fallon didn't blink. He accused Burr of peddling hate under the guise of humor, saying he was part of a larger problem in America, a relic of bigoted comedy masquerading as truth. Bill's smile dropped. The air turned heavy. Cameras captured the flicker of confusion morphing into disbelief across his face. Fallon wasn't done. He dropped a fabricated bombshell, a wild claim that Bill Burr had once been kicked off a film set for calling a black crew member a racial slur. The accusation, completely unverified, hung in the air like poison. Gasps rippled through the audience. Burr leaned back, jaw clenched, the color in his face rising. Fallon, sensing the tension, doubled down, acting as if he were bravely calling out a monster hiding in plain sight. He urged the public to re-examine Burr's body of work, suggesting that the entire comedy industry had protected him for too long. Bill's voice, low and sharp, cut through the tension. The audience couldn't hear the exact words, but his body. Language told the story. Shoulders squared, eyes locked on Fallon with unflinching fury. His rebuttal was no performance. It was personal. He dismantled Fallon's false narrative with icy precision, calling out the host's hypocrisy, from past blackface controversies to the shallow, scripted nature of his interviews. He reminded Jimmy of the time he begged Burr to come on the show when ratings were tanking. He brought up private texts, direct messages, off-air moments that painted a very different picture of Fallon, one desperate to appear woke while living a life riddled with contradiction. The mask slipped. Fallon tried to regain control of the room, stammering out excuses, trying to pivot with a fake laugh and a half-hearted joke about miscommunication. But it was too late. Burr wasn't having it. He stood up mid-show, ripped off his mic, and turned to the audience. Not to apologize, but to remind them not to believe everything said by someone reading off cue cards for a living. The audience sat frozen, many unsure whether to clap or gasp. Fallon, pale and twitching behind his desk, stared blankly as the cameras kept rolling. And then, without another word, Bill walked off the stage. But before he disappeared behind the curtain, he paused. He looked back, and his expression said everything Fallon couldn't. "You just made a serious mistake." The studio erupted. Some cheered, others whispered furiously. On social media, clips of the exchange were already going viral. Fallon sat alone, behind the desk, blinking into the lights, unsure if the show would even go on. And yet, the tension in the room hadn't peaked. Because what viewers didn't know was that something had been building behind the scenes, a pressure ready to blow. The producers were arguing backstage. Fallon's earpiece buzzed with frantic voices. A network executive was demanding to know who approved the segment. Meanwhile, Burr's team was already releasing a statement, calling Fallon's accusations fabricated slander designed to boost ratings during sweeps week. What no one expected was how far Jimmy was willing to go to protect his narrative. The fallout was just beginning, and the real battle for truth and reputation was only getting started. So what really pushed Fallon to sabotage Burr on live television? Was it a long-held grudge, a corporate stunt, or something far more personal? The answer unraveled in the chaos that followed the broadcast. Moments after Bill Burr disappeared behind the curtain, storming past confused crew members and stunned producers, the backstage area turned into a war zone. Phones were ringing. Network execs were demanding immediate explanations. The show's senior producer, Dana Kessler, cornered Jimmy Fallon in his dressing room, her voice sharp, her eyes unblinking. She wanted to know what the hell just happened. Jimmy, now stripped of his on-air polish, sat slouched in a makeup chair, fiddling nervously with a half-empty bottle of water. His team circled him, trying to spin the moment as brave television, insisting it would blow over in a few days with the right PR. But Dana wasn't buying it. She'd worked with Jimmy for over a decade, and this wasn't the host she knew. Something about tonight had been calculated, targeted, personal. She asked again, "Why Burr?" And Jimmy cracked. He started rambling about a comedy festival years ago in Montreal, about how Burr had humiliated him backstage in front of a crowd of comics. Fallon, still an up-and-coming SNL cast member at the time, had tried to riff with the seasoned comics in the green room. Burr, never one to sugarcoat, tore his act apart in front of everyone. Called it Disney Channel with a laugh track. Jimmy had never forgotten. But it wasn't just that. He spoke about the shifting media landscape, the pressure from NBC to rebrand The Tonight Show as socially progressive, the fear of irrelevance. Fallon had been warned, "You're losing the younger audience." His team pitched a confrontation concept, something edgy. Fallon took it a step further. He saw Burr's name on the guest list and saw an opportunity, a high-profile takedown disguised as moral accountability. The plan? Bait him into controversy. Weaponize outrage. Frame it as justice. But he hadn't counted on Bill fighting back so publicly, so mercilessly. Meanwhile, Burr was already out of the building, walking fast toward a waiting SUV, his face burning with rage. He was silent. His assistant tried to speak, but he held up a hand. He needed time. He needed a target. And Fallon had just given him one. By the time Burr got back to his hotel, his phone was already exploding. Texts from comedians, actors, and directors, most expressing support. Others asked what the hell happened. But one message stood out. It was from a former NBC staffer, someone who had worked closely with Fallon. They told Burr that the whole attack had been rehearsed in a closed-door production meeting. There was even a document, bullet points Fallon had written himself, laying out accusations and phrasing for maximum shock value. Burr asked for proof. The file came through an hour later, and what he read made his blood run cold. In explicit language, Fallon had proposed that if Burr didn't play along, the interview would pivot to public reckoning. He listed fake anecdotes, lies. One of them was the racist slur accusation Fallon had lobbed on air. Another was even worse, one that hadn't made it into the final segment. Fallon had planned to suggest that Burr was once investigated for harassing a female staffer during a podcast tour. Another complete fabrication, Burr snapped. The gloves were off. He made one phone call to an old friend who ran a podcast with millions of listeners, the kind of show that didn't edit for corporate polish, the kind that would broadcast every ugly truth, unfiltered. Burr wasn't just going to respond. He was going to bury Fallon in his own hypocrisy. Back at 30 Rock, Jimmy's panic was peaking. The studio's legal team had seen the segment and were already preparing fallback statements in case of litigation. Dana warned Jimmy that he had crossed a line. NBC's lawyers were clear. If Burr sues, you're on your own. The first wave of backlash hit by morning. Clips of Burr's storm-off had dominated the internet overnight. YouTubers, TikTokers, and media pundits dissected every angle, replaying Fallon's words, amplifying Burr's reaction. Hashtags like Fallon cancelled and Justice for Burr were trending. Fallon's team pushed out a vague apology statement citing miscommunication and a misunderstood joke, but no one was buying it. Then Burr dropped the hammer. He went live on the podcast the next evening, stone-faced, holding up the document leaked from Fallon's team. He read the bullet points aloud, his voice steady but lethal. Every lie, every accusation. He walked the audience through Fallon's alleged plan and then tore it apart, calling it what it was: a desperate attempt by a dying format to stay relevant by ruining someone else's career. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He burned Fallon alive with facts, sarcasm, and the kind of unfiltered honesty that made him beloved in the first place. The podcast exploded. Viewership shattered records. But the part that really broke the internet? Burr didn't just talk about Fallon. He called out the entire late-night culture. The hypocrisy, the performative activism, the way these hosts smile to your face and stab you in the back if it means one more headline. He named names. He listed receipts. Fallon, watching the chaos unfold from his penthouse, felt the walls closing in. What started as a petty vendetta had become a wildfire he couldn't contain. But the worst was yet to come. Because someone from Fallon's own crew had gone public, and they were ready to tell the truth about what had really happened behind the scenes, and why this was never just about Bill Burr. Her name was Marissa Lane, a former associate producer on The Tonight Show. She had worked closely with Jimmy Fallon's inner circle for nearly 4 years before resigning 6 months prior. She wasn't famous. She wasn't verified. But when her thread hit X, formerly Twitter, just hours after Burr's Scorched Earth podcast went live, it detonated like a bomb across the media landscape. Marissa laid it all out: screenshots of emails, meeting transcripts, voice recordings of Fallon berating writers, mocking guests after they left, bragging about controlling the narrative. But the most damning detail was this: Fallon had tried this before, multiple times. Bill Burr wasn't the first target. According to Marissa, Fallon had been experimenting with controlled outrage segments. He wanted viral moments that would trend on social media and capture headlines, something raw and unscripted, but calculated to benefit him. Behind closed doors, he referred to it as weaponized wokeness, a phrase that chilled everyone who heard it. His team had tried it once with a lower-profile guest, an indie director with controversial political views. The segment had flopped, but Fallon's taste for scandal didn't fade. It evolved. Bill Burr was supposed to be the golden goose, a real name, a risk that, if it landed, could vault Fallon back to the top of late-night relevance. NBC, desperate to reclaim a slipping demographic, turned a blind eye. Until now, Marissa's exposé rocketed to the top of trending lists. Every media outlet picked it up. Podcasts, reaction videos, long-form breakdowns. Fallon's public image crumbled in real time. His Wikipedia page was being edited every hour. The network scrambled to respond, but it was like trying to plug holes in a sinking ship. Bill Burr, meanwhile, remained silent for a moment. Then he showed up at a comedy benefit event in Boston. He wasn't scheduled to perform. The crowd didn't know he was coming, but when he walked on stage unannounced, they erupted. He didn't dive into a set. He just stood there, soaking in the noise, before delivering a raw, searing 10-minute monologue. Not jokes, not bits. Just truth. About the industry. About integrity. About Fallon. He told the crowd that when you've been around long enough, you learn to spot the frauds from the real ones. He said Fallon's game was never about comedy. It was about control, about power, about looking like the good guy while playing the worst kind behind the curtain. But he didn't end bitter. He thanked his fans. He told them the only reason he was still standing was because they never bought into the illusion, that they knew honesty when they saw it, even when it was ugly, even when it wasn't polished for prime time. He left to a standing ovation. That night, Fallon's fate was sealed. NBC announced a hiatus for The Tonight Show. Behind closed doors, executives were already negotiating his exit. PR firms declined to represent him. Sponsors quietly pulled out. A story leaked that several writers had submitted formal complaints over the past year, citing a toxic environment and Fallon's erratic demands for confrontation-based segments. Within a week, Jimmy Fallon resigned. Publicly, it was framed as a decision to step back and reflect. Privately, it was non-negotiable. The network was hemorrhaging credibility, and someone had to fall on the sword. Fallon became the scapegoat. For his own misfire, Bill Burr declined every major network interview. He didn't want to capitalize on the fallout. He let the story burn itself out while he returned to what he did best: touring, podcasting, writing material on his own terms. The comedy world rallied behind him. And in the process, something shifted. Other comedians started speaking out, not just about Fallon, but about the culture he represented. The performative morality, the empty virtue signaling, the desperation for viral outrage. At the expense of truth, Burr had cracked open a door, and now voices that had long been silenced or dismissed started pouring through. Marissa Lane went on to write a book, a behind-the-scenes look at late-night manipulation and media culture. She donated part of the proceeds to mental health organizations supporting entertainment industry workers. Her name became synonymous with accountability in media. As for Fallon, he disappeared from the spotlight. A few paparazzi shots emerged months later, coffee runs, a trip to the Hamptons, but he never returned to television. Rumors floated about attempted comebacks, podcasts, streaming specials, but nothing materialized. The trust was gone. And, without trust, the spotlight doesn't shine. It burns. In the end, the story wasn't just about one comedian or one talk show. It was about the cost of manufactured outrage, about what happens when truth is twisted into spectacle, and about what it takes to push back, not with rage, but with clarity, with authenticity, with something real. Bill Burr didn't just survive the ambush, he exposed it. And in doing so, he reminded the world that in an era of scripted outrage and curated virtue, there's still power in unscripted honesty. The stage may be polished, the lights may be bright, but truth, that always hits hardest when the cameras won't cut.